We continue with the partial motion hearing of August 10th, 2006. The Court. Mr. Fallon, any witnesses for the state? Attorney Fallon. Yes, the state will be presenting witnesses. State would call as its first witness Tom Fassbender. Special Agent Thomas Fassbender, called as a witness herein, having been first duly sworn, was examined and testified as follows. The Clerk. Please be seated. Please state your name and spell your last name for the record. Thomas Fassbender, Fassbender. Direct examination by Attorney Fallon. What do you do for a living? I'm a special agent with the Wisconsin Department of Justice, Division of Criminal Investigation. How long have you been so employed? With DCI, I've been employed 21 years. And prior to that, any law enforcement experience? I had 5 years as a patrol officer on the State Patrol. What's your current assignment as an agent with the Department of Justice? I currently work with our Special Assignments Bureau, which is primarily responsible for homicide investigations. All right, and how long have you held that particular assignment? About 5 years. Prior to that, what duties or assignments did you hold? When I came in with DCI, I was a narcotics agent for 5 years. And then I went into white collar and government corruption for about 11 years. During that period, I worked internet crimes against children for about 2 years at the same time. All right, with respect to your current assignment, approximately how many homicide investigations have you been involved in? Well, if we're counting what we term cold case homicide investigations, I have a file drawer full of those, which would go anywhere from 8 to 15 cases there. Other homicide investigations, probably anywhere from 5 to 10. All right, now, during those particular investigations, where are those homicide investigations? Where do they take place? What is your jurisdiction or area of operation? Jurisdiction-wise would be the state of Wisconsin. All right. With respect to this particular case, I would like to draw your attention to November 5th, 2005. How did you become involved in this case? The assistance of DCI was requested by the Calumet County Sheriff's Department, and I was assigned by my supervisor. And did you arrive upon the scene of the Avery Auto Salvage Yard on November 5th? Yes, somewhere shortly around 2 p.m. that day. Had you had any association at all with the missing person case involving Teresa Halbach prior to that? No. All right. When you arrived at 2 p.m., which law enforcement agency was in control and in charge? Calumet County Sheriff? All right. At some point during the investigation, let's ask the question this way. What was your role? As a member of the Division of Criminal Investigation, what was your role in this missing persons case on November 5th? Initially, it was to come in and provide assistance to the Calumet County Sheriff's Department investigating the scene. And shortly after arrival and having some briefing sessions, I took over a role as co-lead investigator. All right, who was the other co-lead investigator in the case? Investigator Mark Wiegert from the Calumet Sheriff's Department. And approximately how long after your 2 p.m. arrival did that take place, roughly? I'm not real sure. Probably within an hour and a half. All right. Were you on site when a search warrant was obtained? Yes. All right. And are you familiar with the area which was the subject of the search? Yes. All right. Specifically, I would like to first of all draw your attention to, I believe it's Exhibit 18, if I'm correct. Yes, Exhibit 18. Are you familiar with what is depicted in Exhibit 18? Yes, it's the Avery's salvage yard with some additional properties up in the northwest corner. I believe that is Stephen Avery's residence. Barb Yonder's residence is up in that area, would be an additional several acres up there. All right. And the overall area, which was subject to the search warrant that was obtained, was how many acres? approximately 40 acres. All right, and what is depicted in Exhibit 18, is that a fair and accurate depiction of the Avery Auto Salvage Yard and the adjoining properties? Yes, that would be that, and that would be the scene, the initial scene we were dealing with. So what is depicted there is the 40 acres? Yes. With respect to the 40 acres, are you aware of the breakdown as to how much of that general area contained the auto salvage yard business and its inventory? Yes, approximately 37 acres would have been attributed to that. All right, and during the course of the investigation, were you able to determine a ballpark estimate as to approximately how many junk cars, for lack of a better term, are located on the 37-acre portion of the parcel? Initially, when we got there, we believed it to be well over 1,000 junk cars, and ultimately, a rough count was taken by searchers that put it more in the neighborhood of 36 to 3,800 junk cars. All right, and in terms of including residences and commercial buildings, approximately how many buildings are located on that parcel? About 15. All right, out of the 15, how many of them were residences which were subject to the execution of the search warrant? 4. And did the 4 also include immediate outbuildings, such as garages? That is correct, yes. All right, and the remaining buildings there were commercial buildings or support buildings for the business of the salvage yard? Yes, with the exception of one. I guess you would term it a house trailer, alongside the road going down to Barbionda and Steve Avery's residence. It was a large trailer alongside that road. I would count that as a building that was searched. All right, now, when the warrant was obtained and about to be executed, were any precautions taken to secure the overall premises? Again, directing your attention to Exhibit 18. Yes. All right, and tell us about those. Well, there were checkpoints established out on the primary, or the main highway, running parallel to the property, as well as a checkpoint coming into the property on Avery Road. There was, as you got down to the end of Avery Road, or the south end of Avery Road, and getting onto the Avery property, business property, is where a command post had been set up. All right, if I were to, I'm going to give you a laser pointer. If you would just direct out where the command post was located. Attorney Buting. Could he mark it? The witness. I don't think I will have to. It's real near number 3, where 3 is marked. Just maybe a little south of 3 there. You can see some vehicles and stuff. So it would have been right at that nexus, right around 3. Question by Attorney Fallon. Now, I would also like to direct your attention to Exhibit 19, which is behind you on the chalkboard. Yes. Are you familiar with what is depicted there? Yes. All right. And just so that we're clear, what is depicted in Exhibit 19? That's an aerial view, a little broader version of an aerial view that shows the Avery salvage yard and adjoining properties, about right in the center of that view, and then the surrounding parcels of land and property. All right. I believe we had a stipulation yesterday, but just to illustrate your testimony, can you refer to where this Highway 147 is located on Exhibit 19? Certainly, with the pointer. It's running essentially east-west, east to southwest, right there, which would be about one parcel of land or field north of the Avery property. All right, now, you indicated there was a checkpoint that was set up. Can you describe the locations on using Exhibit 19 to tell us where the checkpoints were? Okay, the day that I arrived, I can't remember if the checkpoints out on the highway had been set up yet. I'm not going to speak to that for sure, but I know if they weren't, shortly thereafter, the highway checkpoints would have been set up. All right. The highway checkpoints would have been out on Highway 147, which would have been to the west of the Avery property, somewhere toward the upper left corner of this picture. All right, I'm going to give you a pen. If you could just put a check mark and the number 1, that may illustrate that, please. Is the area where the checkpoint located, is that on the map? Or could it be further west or further east of what is depicted there? Do you recall? To my memory, the checkpoints may have moved during the course of the week. They may have expanded. They may have started, closer to Avery Road and then eventually expanded out a little further. All right. So that's where I'm having problems, definitely putting the X. All right. On where it was at any given point. Okay. I know sometimes it was as far west as here, but it may have been as close as this, early in the week. All right. We'll put a check on each of those locations then. The one furthest to your left, we'll make that number 1, and then right. And if that is the little city I'm thinking about here, I know there was an intersection of a road. Attorney Buting, could we identify what road the names of those roads are, if you know? The witness, I'm not going to be able to do that. It's just that there was Highway 147. There was an intersection, and I'm going to, again, put an X there and a 1 by that one. And it may have been as close as to what I'm designating as X2, to the west of Avery Road. Question by Attorney Fallon. Is it possible there could have been one even further west, which is not depicted on the map? It's possible, and I'm not going to say for sure at this point. Were there any checkpoints on Avery Road? Yes. All right, and tell us about those. The checkpoints on Avery Road, again, moved. Generally, during the day, when we were there working, the checkpoint was toward the north end of Avery Road out near Highway 147. Pretty close to the intersection of Avery Road and 147? That's correct. All right, so put a check there. I will put an X there with a 3. All right, and you said it moved. Tell us about that. At night, when most of the personnel, the investigative personnel, left the scene, they would oftentimes draw that back in toward the command post area. What was the thinking for that? The thinking was to draw it back in, contain the scene a little better, and actually have that personnel right there at the corner of the scene to provide security for the scene and also for break purposes because there were porta potties and stuff that were there and food and water and shift changes and stuff like that. All right, now, were there any checkpoints east of Avery Road on 147? Anything that you can place on our map there? Or were they farther east than what is depicted? I don't believe so. I think they were around this intersection, in this vicinity of this intersection on Highway 147. All right. I will put an X4 there. All right. You may resume your seat. Directing your attention again to Exhibit 18, the 40-acre plot of land depicted there, once the initial search warrant was obtained and you began the searches, was that area under your continuous control? Yes. And when did you give up control of that 40-acre plot of land? Saturday, November 12th, at about 11:28 a.m. All right. Now, during the course of the week that you were there, was there plans made to secure the premises, the perimeter of the 40-acre plot on Exhibit 18? Yes? All right. And what can you tell us about that? The plans to secure the perimeter was to have law enforcement personnel, at minimum, on each corner of the property. All right. And was that around the clock securance? Yes. All right. And at any point during the 7 days, did you ever leave? Were any of the guards removed or any of the postings from the four corners of the property? Other than shift changes, to my knowledge, no. All right. Was it Lieutenant Sipple and Lieutenant Bowe from the Calumet County Sheriff's Department who were in charge of the overall perimeter security? Yes. All right. Again, returning to the time on November 5th when Detective Wiegert and Detective Remaker and others returned with the search warrant? What was the initial plan or focus of executing the search warrant? That would have been to do a protective sweep of the buildings on that scene, and also to search for Teresa Halbach. All right, and what did you mean by protective sweep? What was the point or purpose of that? When law enforcement executes a search warrant or a search, we generally do a protective sweep for our safety or the satisfy of anyone on that scene to look for anything that could endanger us people. People armed with weapons, whatever. All right. And that's so you could also see if there were any other individuals who were actually on the premises at the time the search warrant was being executed? Certainly. All right. You also said that the other point or purpose was to look for Teresa Halbach. Tell us about that. Well, essentially, this was a missing case, or a missing person investigation at that point. And the search warrant was to look for one of the things, the search warrant, was to look for the body, or to look for Teresa Halbach, in the hopes of finding her alive. All right? And that was the primary purpose at that time. And given that primary purpose, were there any, well, given that as a purpose, how did you go about attempting to accomplish that particular aspect? What did you do? Based on the personnel we had, teams were set up to disseminate throughout the property and do that sweep through the buildings, looking for a protective sweep and looking for Teresa. All right. Now, in your capacity as an agent with the Department of Justice, have you been involved in the execution of search warrants? Yes. Numerous times? Yes. In terms of focus, for instance, is there a difference in the way you approach things if the focus is looking for a particular person as opposed to looking for something like blood or narcotics or something of a smaller size? Most certainly. All right, tell us about that. If I'm looking for something larger size, something obvious or evident, it's obvious that that search is going to be a little quicker and easier because it's much more visible and apparent. If I'm looking for evidence that might constitute forensic evidence or trace evidence, so to speak, blood or hair or fibers, that's going to be a much more detailed search, which may involve artificial lighting, may involve getting down on hands and knees, using magnifying glasses, etc. So there's a big difference. One could conceivably call it a search, while the other one may be, searching for evidence and then the processing and collection of evidence. So there's a difference. All right. Now, in terms of organizing the search teams, who organized the teams? It would have been either myself or investigator Wiegert, or someone in our stead at times. And I believe that probably would have been, in this instance, investigator Wiegert, because I would have been involved with the search of my own, or with one of the dogs at that time. Now, all right. How did you and investigator Wiegert assign responsibilities or duties during the execution of the search warrant? Again, based on the personnel present, a decision had been previously made that Calumet was going to take over the investigation, and that resources being as they were, we were going to use Manitowoc County personnel to assist in the investigation of the scene and the search of the scene. And basically, what we decided to do, as the teams were set up, we would have either a person or an investigator from Calumet County or DCI accompany Manitowoc County personnel if they were on a search team. All right, now, what kind of teams were actually put together? I'm not sure if I understand the question. Is there a difference, for instance, from a search team and or an evidence collection team? Well, certainly. Again, this initial search, we weren't concerned with having evidence collection technicians on those particular teams, necessarily. It may have been deputies. It may have been jail personnel. It may have been DCI agents on the teams. Again, their primary purpose was the protective sweep and the searching for Teresa, and not necessarily a concern for finding and locating trace evidence, so to speak. All right. And did there come a time when the focus shifted from looking for Teresa to one looking more detailed, looking for more trace evidence, as it were, or other evidentiary items found or listed in the warrant? Yes. All right. Tell us about that. What happened was they did the protective sweep and the search for Teresa in the buildings area. After that, we had some trained cadaver dogs come in, and I initially accompanied one of those trained cadaver dogs with some other personnel. And we did a search all along the south end of the property where the dog alerted on Teresa's RAV4 vehicle. We continued that search along that south border of the property and actually into the adjoining property owned by Redant. During that time, additional dogs arrived and additional searches were done, utilizing the dogs of some of the buildings. Just a walkthrough, basic search with the dogs to see if the dogs alerted on anything. Again, the thinking being, if the dog alerted on something, that might be a clue or an assist in helping locate Teresa or the body of Teresa Halbach. And again, that was a fairly quick search, walking the dogs through. Now, when you say fairly quick search, are you referring to the buildings? Yes. All right. Were the dogs used to search other areas of the property? Yes. Tell us about that. Again, Lieutenant Sipple and Bo would probably be better to address that. But the dogs were used to take into the pit area, the salvage area, walking through and around cars and to see if they were alerting on anything there. So that's that 37-acre area that we were talking about. So would it be fair to say that when you were using the dogs, the primary focus was still looking for Teresa or something, or some part of her remains, for instance? Certainly. All right. Now, you indicated you mentioned something about the Toyota RAV4. Did you have any involvement in securing that item of evidence? To a degree. Sometime after I arrived, we had approached the RAV4 and used a flashlight to confirm that there was no body in the RAV4. While we were there, we were getting reports and seeing obvious signs of inclement weather approaching, getting reports of serious inclement weather approaching. The crime lab, Wisconsin State Crime Lab, was involved, and I was in contact with them. And as such, we would be agreeing to attempt to put a tarp over the RAV4 vehicle, which we did. Inclement weather arrived, and there was some rain, not the worst of it yet, but that was accompanied by some high winds. And the winds were blowing the tarp all over. So ultimately, we went back to that scene, and we ended up removing the tarp because it was just flailing around anyways. You couldn't keep the tarp on because of the weather? No. At some point, was the vehicle removed? Yes. Approximately when? Approximately 8:45 p.m. All right. You mentioned something about serious inclement weather on the way. What concerns, if any, did that pose for you during the course of executing the search warrant? Well, that, as well as other things. We were getting into dark now, losing daylight. Searching, anything, is much better and well done during daylight as opposed to artificial light or in the dark. And to that horrendous rainstorm that ultimately moved in that evening, very much limiting any of the outdoor search, except for the removal of the RAV4, which we accomplished in that storm. How bad was the weather? It was raining extremely hard when the storm hit, as hard as I have experienced. How long did that rain persist? I don't remember exactly, but most of the night that we worked there, it was raining. All right. And did that create some concerns with you with respect to evidence detection and collection? Well, obviously, we had concerns with any evidence collection and detection outside, coupled with the dark. Lights were brought in to illuminate the southeast corner where the RAV4 was found, that area, but the rain affected that quite heavily also. So we were fairly or pretty much limited to inside or in-building searches at this time. All right, I will come back to that in a minute. I would like to direct your attention again to Exhibit 19, and which is behind you, and ask, during the course of the week that you were executing the search warrant on the premises depicted in Exhibit 18, were you called upon to investigate or participate or coordinate searches of surrounding areas? Yes, and tell us about that. Ultimately, when we were done searching, it was estimated that we had searched approximately 600 to 800 acres of property. That's in addition to the 40 acres? In addition to the 40 acres on the Avery properties. And that property included a lot of surrounding areas which were gravel pits, sand pits, I think most of them owned by Redant, and then many ponds and lakes. I'm not sure of the count, but numerous ponds and lakes that had to be searched, either with dive teams or walkthroughs of some sort. Again, all taxing the personnel and resources during the course of that week. With respect to your role and investigator Wiegert's role, were the two of you responsible or more or less in charge of the perimeter searches? In other words, the 600 to 700 acres. Was that your responsibility or someone else's? That would have been more Lieutenant Bowe and Sipple coordinating that, managing that part. But who oversaw their work? Investigator Wiegert, myself. All right. And returning then to the weather on Saturday night and limiting to building searches, did there come a time where you and or Investigator Wiegert directed various search teams to enter the buildings? Yes. All right. And tell us how that came to pass. I keep returning to this, but again, pertaining to the personnel we had present and the resources yet available that evening, now we're organizing what we believe to be a search to look for evidence, potential processing, and collection of evidence. And for such a search, we need evidence technicians or trained officers who were trained in the collection of evidence. All right, and on Saturday night, I would say approximately 7:30 or thereabouts, how many evidence technicians or evidence collection teams were available on Saturday? I believe we put one evidence collection team together that night. All right. During the course of the week, were other evidence collection teams put together? Yes, and I'm going to back up. Saturday night, if you count the crime lab, the two technicians that came from the crime lab, we would have had two. All right. What assignment did the crime lab people have on Saturday night? To process and seize and transport the RAV4, Teresa's vehicle. Did they actually do an examination or processing of the vehicle itself on scene, or just the collection and removal? The only thing they processed or looked at on scene was the debris and the items that had been used to conceal the vehicle, but the vehicle itself, to my knowledge, no. All right, and what happened to the crime lab after the vehicle was removed? The crime lab personnel after the vehicle was removed? The crime lab personnel remained with the vehicle. I believe one of the technicians rode with the individual towing the vehicle, while the other one followed the vehicle or led the way to Madison. All right, so in terms of after they left the scene, you only had one evidence collection team on site that evening? Correct. All right, so in terms of using their capabilities, what was the plan? The plan was to start searching buildings, and we started with Stephen Avery's residence on the northwest corner of the property at about 7:30, if I remember right. All right, and did there come a time that you and or Investigator Wiegert directed additional entries into Mr. Avery's trailer? Yes. All right, and did there come a time where you directed additional entries to other residences during the course of the week? I believe so, yes. And the businesses or buildings associated with the business? Yes. All right. And there's been some testimony that through the course of the week, and in particular the first 5 days, there were as many as, I think perhaps 8 entries, thereabouts, to Mr. Avery, Stephen Avery's trailer, and 3 or 4 entries to the garage. So what was it about the circumstances in your mind that caused you to direct successive or additional entries, first of all, with respect to Mr. Avery's trailer? I think that's a longer answer than you might anticipate. But additionally, we have the same. You have got your protective sweep and looking for a body and using the dogs. I would categorize those into basically the same type of search, a walkthrough, a sweep. So you have 2 entries there. I have got a search warrant for a scene here, which is a 40-acre scene. I don't have a search warrant specifically for any building or Stephen's house or Barbara's house. I have got a 40-acre scene here. That's why I say I'm holding that scene, okay? Ultimately, that evening, we get a team put together and we start the buildings. We start with Stephen's residence. When the technicians go in there, they are looking for evidence that's obvious. And they are also looking for trace or forensic evidence, which is a little more difficult, sometimes, to detect. At this point in time, you're talking it's dark, it's night, you've got a horrendous rainstorm going. We want to look to the best of our abilities for that type of evidence. Because of the rain, because of people maybe going in and out of their house to get evidence, collection bags, gloves, whatever they need, flashlights, you run the risk of evidence being, in effect, destroyed or lost. So we look for that type of evidence as quickly as possible, because that is the most susceptible to that type of danger. So they go in there about 7:30. Keeping in mind also at this point in time, most of those investigators that went in that trailer are already going on 12 hours or more of work. So you're talking that they are getting tired. There could be safety issues and exhaustion is becoming a factor. So they go in there. Does that affect the ability to locate and collect evidence? I would think, based on your experience. So, yes. Was that based? I felt it, yes. All right. So they go in there until about 10:30, and they clear Stephen's residence that evening. They come back, and we have Mark and I, as well as the sheriff and other people that are involved, Sybil and Bo, or whoever, are continually having debriefing sessions and planning sessions and assessing what's going on, taking in all the intelligence information that's happening. We debrief that team, and even as early as that night, in my mind, I'm telling people, or my mind, I'm thinking, either that night or the next night, I'm telling people, we're not done in that house. We're going back there for several reasons. Number one, they noted guns. They talked to us about a vacuum cleaner and having taken, I believe, the bag out of the vacuum cleaner. But we talked about the roll, about the brush that's in the vacuum cleaner, how that can possibly collect trace evidence. And we're going to want to take that. Bedding in a spare bedroom? Yeah, we're going to want to take that. That's how these things occurred, you know? What did you find? What did you see in that residence? We're going to want that. All right. That building is still part of my scene. This is an ongoing search. So as early as that, we're going to be returning there. That night, that completed that night. The following evening is when we continued the search in process, involving going into the buildings, including Stephen's garage. Question. Now, did the apparent evidentiary significance of items observed in the buildings, in particular Mr. Avery's trailer, did that change during the course of the week? Certainly. Tell us about that. Beginning just at that first night, we have investigative personnel. To start with, We have investigative personnel up in Marinette at the Avery's other property up north who are speaking with Avery members, gleaning intelligence and information which is being reported back to us. We have investigators at the scene that are going out and doing interviews either of relatives, family members, friends, or just people who may have been involved in this scene. We have neighborhood canvasses that are started the following day. We're constantly bringing in intelligence and information, assessing that information and intelligence. We have evidence teams that are finding evidence, and we're making determinations on what's been found, what we need to look for. Do we need to look somewhere else, or are there things that we're missing? That's all affecting what's going on in this ongoing process. This is not a static process. That's just standing still. We have a RAV4 that went down to the crime laboratory that's being analyzed. I think it's as early as Sunday that there's a presumptive positive test for human blood in that vehicle. That's affecting what we may be doing or what we're looking for, obviously. Question. All right. Now, at some point, did the crime lab come down and assist further in the search of the scene and or the collection of evidence or the identification of evidence? Yes, they came back. The other team came back on Sunday, I believe, later afternoon, Sunday. And what did they do to assist in either the identification or collection of additional evidence? They were being sent all over the place. Again, on Sunday, we have search teams that are going out and searching. We're accounting for the vehicles, the trunks of the vehicles, underneath the vehicles, and the insides of the vehicles, the car crusher, the crushed vehicles, the crushed vehicle in the car crusher, the buildings, and even maybe starting some of the surrounding areas. As the search teams are going through, again, they're not necessarily evidence technicians, but they're looking for potential evidence or identifying potential evidence and either marking or flagging the potential evidence. And that could include, and in many instances did include, potential blood in junk vehicles. And the crime lab was being utilized to go check or analyze those areas of potential evidence to see if it needed to be collected, if it was blood, if it wasn't blood. They went to vehicles. I think they went to a golf cart at one time to check something that had been found in a golf cart. Ultimately, they were directed to go back, or asked to go back into Stephen Avery's residence to use alternate light sources to check for the presence of blood. All right, and did they, in fact, go into Mr. Avery's residence at some time during the course of one of these searches with alternate light sources to look for blood? Yes, I believe they did that Sunday evening. All right. And did they actually collect what they observed, or how did you work with them? Best utilizing their abilities, of course. Yes, generally, they would be able to identify and help process. And the collection of evidence, if they collected it, it was immediately turned over to Calumet County personnel. Attorney Beating. I'm going to object to his testimony about what they did or didn't do in Mr. Avery's residence unless this witness was there and observed it. Attorney Fallon. I will clear up with the foundation question. Question by Attorney Fallon. Were you responsible? Strike that. Let's try it this way. Once someone entered a residence and did something in the residence, was that information conveyed back to you in the command post or Detective Wiegert? Yes. All right. So in terms of your responsibility and Investigator Wiegert's responsibility, you were made aware of the results or what the observations were during the course of entering any of these residences? I would believe so. In most of the cases, yes. Now, specifically, since the crime lab personnel work also for the Department of Justice, did you have constant contact with them regarding what they were doing and how they were assisting? The majority of the time, yes, I agree. Now, with respect to their participation in one of the searches of Mr. Avery's trailer, that being Stephen Avery's trailer, with respect to using an alternate light source. Were you made aware of that? Yes. Attorney Buting. Objection. Hearsay. The Court. For purposes of this hearing, I think it's relevant to determine how this witness acted and what he did, rather than for the truth of the matter, so I'm going to accept it on that basis. Attorney Fallon. Fine, thank you. Question by Attorney Fallon. So, did the crime lab collect evidence after they went through? Attorney Buting. Same objection. It's hearsay as to what was done inside that house if he wasn't there. He can talk about why he did or didn't do things afterwards, but it's hearsay for him to relate what someone else did outside of his presence and came back and told him. What other purpose does the state have to offer that? The Court. Mr. Fallon? Attorney Fallon. Certainly. First of all, it does go to the state of mind. After all, he is one of the two people responsible for the overall execution of this warrant. He's already established the fact that he and investigator Wiegert were in charge of the investigation, so they were clearly made aware. He's already testified that there were debriefings after each search. This is all information that factors into the decision-making process as to how that warrant was executed. Secondly, under 90401, a certain amount of hearsay under these circumstances is permitted. Third, taking the court's previous example, it does go relative to his state of mind. The Court. For purposes of this hearing, what they found or what they didn't find isn't really that important. It's hearsay if it's introduced for the purpose of proving the truth of the matter asserted. In this case, I take the information to be an explanation of why orders were given, why searches were ordered to be conducted, why they came back the next day. And I think so for that purpose, which is most relevant to the defense motion here, it is not hearsay because it's not offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. Therefore, I'm going to allow it. Attorney Fallon. Thank you. Question by Attorney Fallon. What occurred with respect to the crime lab's participation and what effect did that have on you in terms of what you were doing and organizing with respect to continuation of the executing the search warrant? They identified additional areas in Stephen's trailer that show the presence of blood, or the potential presence of blood. They collected a few of the areas. They identified the other areas as areas that were needed to go in and collect yet. And subsequent to that, did you direct additional entries to collect the information requested by the crime lab? Yes. All right. Are you an evidence technician, by the way? I have attended a week-long evidence technician course put on by the State Crime Laboratory. All right. After you directed the subsequent entries suggested by the crime lab, in other words, the collection of these additional samples, in your mind, was the execution of the search warrant as a whole completed? Absolutely not. With respect to the part of the warrant permitting entrance, authorizing entrance to Mr. Avery's trailer and his garage, for that matter, after Sunday evening, did you, in your mind, think that you had completed or, quote, gotten everything there was to get? Attorney Buting. I think what's in his mind is really irrelevant. It's ultimately going to be a legal question. It's more what he did and didn't do. He's not. Attorney Fallon. It's a foundational question to explain subsequent conduct. The Court. Well, in a sense, you're both right. Even what his thoughts were may not necessarily control the outcome of the decision on your motion, but as both parties have already informed the Court, there's not a lot of case law on this, and it may be that what was going through his mind is important, so for that reason, I'm going to allow the question. Question by Attorney Fallon. Did you feel you had completed that portion of the execution of the search warrant with respect to the defendant's residence and garage? Answer. Based on a lot on the factors I already talked about, no. All right, and why not? Reiterating a lot of those factors and the purpose of a lot of those searches up to that point, we were not done with those areas. We had, like I said, after the first forensic search, based on the weather and lighting conditions, exhaustion of the searchers, I knew that building, even without Stephen being the primary suspect necessarily, was going to be searched again. It was too likely that things would have been missed based on those factors. They did see some things in there, guns and stuff, that we needed to go back in and get the following day due to the lateness of the hour, etc. And we did. We knew there was a computer in there that we had to obtain information off of, which we got a separate search warrant for. And then the crime lab was asked to go in because that first search team found evidence of blood in there. So we asked them to use their technology to determine if there was any other blood in there. Again, as I said, this was ongoing. After they identified other areas of blood, we knew we had to go back there and collect those items. During this whole course of things, through debriefings and interviews being conducted, we're obtaining more intelligence information that tends to indicate that Stephen is definitely the suspect, or a suspect in this case, which makes it even more relevant that we make sure we do a complete and thorough search of that area before we release the scene. With respect to that, what additional information was uncovered on Tuesday, for instance, that led you to continue the belief that you needed to gain additional entry into the trailer and the garage? What was happening? Number one, Monday, we were busy in other areas, again in the junkyard, other buildings, etc. So we did not get back to Stephen's trailer on Monday like we'd planned to, because of what the crime lab showed and just my beliefs. So Tuesday, it was planned to go back in there. I believe Tuesday they went back in there and got the computer. And then Tuesday we were going back in. That's where we put the team up to go back in there and hopefully do a final thorough search of that trailer. Things that were coming in, from interviews and intelligence, we're interviewing people and finding that Stephen's initial story, it was inconsistent with later stories that he had given, whether to us or to the press. We have other interviews of other individuals that are contradicting his statements. We have information coming in from the crime lab, the presence of blood. And I believe it was Tuesday, and I'm not sure, but I believe it was Tuesday. I was advised by the crime lab that DNA analyzed from the RAV4 matched up with Stephen Avery's DNA from the Wisconsin DNA database. That may have been later on Tuesday, but these are the types of things that are coming in and we're analyzing and basing our decisions on. Did the fact that there were bone fragments uncovered from a burn pit on Tuesday factor into the equation? I'm sure that factored into the equation to make sure that the residence was searched properly and held. I'm not sure what time of day the bone fragments were found, whether they were found a little later or the search had conducted earlier, so I'm going to say I'm not sure. All right. During the course of overseeing the execution of the search warrant, were you and/or investigator Wiegert, more or less, was your attention drawn away from the scene to other locales outside of the perimeter here? Oh yes, a lot of times. Tell us about that and why you felt that you had to address those. Again, you are getting information from many different sources, whether it's evidence technicians finding evidence, or agents or investigators doing interviews and obtaining information and intelligence, and you perform sort of a triage, I guess. Is this something that we need to address? Do we have the personnel and resources to address it now, or could it wait? And a good example, we had the crime lab personnel running around trying to address different areas. During Tuesday, I think it was Tuesday morning, license plates were found in a vehicle in a yard that were Teresa Halbach's license plates from her vehicle. At that point, we made the decision to pull the crime lab off what they were doing to go address the seizure and the processing of the plates from that vehicle. Other areas where maybe blood was found, we were directing evidence technicians to go there. We had search teams out there were identifying these various areas of evidence. They would report back to us and we would determine, do we need to send somebody there now? Or can we just hold that scene until we get someone available to go process that? We need people who have been trained in processing evidence to do that. And we only had so many people that were trained to do that, so we're constantly making those decisions. We had a site that potentially could have been a clandestine burial site that we pretty much pulled everyone off of for quite a period of time until we determined that it wasn't. Where was that? Was that in the perimeter or somewhere else? That was outside the perimeter, to the west. And were individuals dispatched to areas such as Maribel Caves Park? We had intelligence coming in that some pants, and I think some lotion or something, had been found at this park. So yes, we dispatched some evidence technicians over there. We had a report of a cell phone being found in the ditch. We ultimately dispatched people there. We had that clandestine site. We had reports of some bones found on some property west of this area that Mark and I actually went out on because there was no one available, technicians available, that we checked. That. When you say Mark, you mean Mr. Wiegert, our investigator, Wiegert. We had intelligence coming in from interviews that someone may have seen something. For example, a bus driver dropping someone off, that we had to send people out to interview and obtain information from that person. All right, now, during the course of this week-long event, did you have assistance of other law enforcement agencies? Yes. All right, what agencies assisted? Wow, I don't even know the whole list, but the State Patrol for sure. They were assisting in perimeter security, I think from day 1 or day 2, and then en masse. I think on Tuesday was the first day they were there en masse, where upwards of 60 troopers arrived to help search that, go over that yard again. When you say the yard, you're talking about the salvage yard? The salvage yard, the vehicles, and they actually came and assisted in searching the properties adjacent to the Avery properties. All right, other law enforcement entities assist? Of course, Manitowoc County Sheriff, Manitowoc City. I think Two Rivers may have had some people there, and then Calumet County Sheriff's Department, obviously, and some various, I think, police departments in Calumet County also assisted in perimeter and scene protection and security. And then, at some point, did you receive assistance from some local firemen? Yes. All right. And how were they employed? I believe the first day they were employed was on Sunday, and they were employed in searching the vehicles. And I believe they brought in their jaws of life to open trunks of vehicles and car doors and whatever needed to be opened. And they were broken up into teams. I believe each of those teams had at least one law enforcement personnel with them. And they went through the yard and went through every vehicle to make sure that, again, Teresa, or evidence of Teresa, was not apparent in those vehicles. And that's in the vehicles, under the vehicles. Evidence that the vehicles had been moved or not moved. And if it was moved, we had to get personnel in there to lift that vehicle up, move it, check under it. All right, now, in terms of having at least the benefit of these additional resources, did that ease the strain at all with respect to the actual evidence collection processing component associated with the execution of the warrant? Not nearly as much, no, because these people weren't trained to process or collect evidence. Who was responsible for coordinating their efforts? The efforts of whom? The State Patrol, the firemen, the Two Rivers officers, in other words, the supporting law enforcement cast, as it were. The hands-on person was probably more Lieutenant Sipple and Bow, but Investigator Wiegert and I were ultimately responsible for what we were going to do. All right. And you decide how they were going to be employed. These law enforcement assists? Yes. All right. During the course of the week, do you recall you mentioned 2 evidence collection teams? Were there other evidence collection teams available at your disposal? Off the top of my head, Sunday, we had 2 primary evidence collection teams made up of Calumet County Sheriff's evidence technicians, Manitowoc County, and Manitowoc City. And then we had the crime lab personnel, who I would describe more as roving where needed. And then later in the week, we actually brought in an evidence technician from the Grand Chute Police Department that assisted us. All right, now, all this is going on. Did you have law enforcement personnel in other parts of the state who were collecting information and providing it to you during the execution of the search warrant? Yes. Tell us about that. Attorney Buting. Objection. It's irrelevant. Attorney Fallon. It goes to the resource allocation issue and how they went about their business. They keep questioning why it took 8 searches or 4 days to complete processing of that. All goes to that explanation. Now, the hallmark of Fourth Amendment is reasonableness under the circumstances. The court. I will let you ask a few questions about it. Attorney Fallon. Thank you. Answer. The primary area in question would have been up in Marinette County, where the Averys have property up there. And many of the Averys were there on that Saturday, November 5. So I did, allocate special agents to go up there. We had Marinette County personnel up there. I had special agents running definitely throughout Manitowoc County as well as into other counties, following up leads, reports of this or that. I had many special agents transporting evidence from the Avery property or Calumet Sheriff's Department down to Madison Crime Lab to forensic anthropologists down there. So, yeah, a lot of special DCI personnel were eaten up doing a lot of that too. Were there other, what I guess, for lack of a better term, were there other volunteers who assisted in the searches? Yes. All right. And who is responsible? When did they come into play? For my part, or our part, I'm going to guess midweek, talking about the week of November 7. Mid to early week, we realized we had acres and acres and acres of property outside the 40-acre Avery scene that still needed to be walked through and searched. There was a point in time that we weren't sure we had a body. And we decided to utilize the searchers who were still standing by, hanging around. The civilian searchers that Ryan Hilligas had kind of coordinated. And so we decided to utilize them to walk through some of those areas outside of that 40-acre area, accompanied by, again, a member of law enforcement. All right, now, were there other neighborhood canvasses or leads called in by just citizens that impacted upon the allocation of resources? Yes. Tell us about that. We had leads coming in, like I said. I mentioned the cell phone. Someone found a cell phone. There were leads coming in that someone said, or people said, they saw Teresa or saw Teresa's vehicle. We had to send investigators out to that. We were finding evidence on the property that would lead investigators to go out. For example, handcuffs and leg irons, and receipts for the purchase of such things. We sent people out on. We had just lost my train of thought. Okay, so you had received information or benefits from some community searchers? Yes. All right, 1 second. During the course of executing the initial search warrant here, at some point, did you become cognizant of the fact that this was taking several days? Oh, absolutely. And what, if anything, did you do? Or what did you do in recognition of that? Well, if I understand your question correctly, number 1, holding the scene. Right. Number 2, attempting to get additional resources and personnel in place. Right. Number 3, we did obtain additional search warrants for various things, and ultimately, midweek, we obtained another search warrant for the whole scene. Right. Now, in terms of your experience, have you ever been involved in overseeing the execution of a search warrant this comprehensive? No. In terms of your experience with the Department of Justice, have you ever been involved in the execution of a search warrant of this magnitude that I was personally involved with? Yes. No. All right. Attorney Fallon. That's all.